All right, shall we continue on to session 5 then? I think we've got.
I think, continue to session 5. I hope you can all see my lecture slides. It's already 1 past 6 Central European time, so I might just go on with that. So in contrast to what I've just been talking about, it's not about personal and cultural barriers, but about institutional barriers to mitigating the carbon footprint of research. Um, this might be even a more interesting session for all of you who are interested in what is the system behind that prevents this. So let me just shortly again outline how I structure this session. I will again say a little bit about this climate-friendly climate research feasibility assessment I conducted, because the results from in this base mostly on findings in my qualitative research. Then I've again structured the presentation on basically 3 main pillars, which is research infrastructure, events, and communication, what you've already known from my last session and also from the session before, session 3. And then at the end, I will leave some time this time to have more feedback, interaction, and audience participation. Again, as in the last session, I will have a short period with audience feedback, polls, and interaction after each thematic block. So, coming to the feasibility assessment for the personal and cultural barriers, I mostly used the quantitative analysis, and this time I'm using a qualitative analysis. During the summer, I conducted expert interviews with 9 key stakeholders in the research system. Some of them I can see in the audience, and some are at other universities. And these stakeholders were active in the field of research infrastructure, events, and communication. Apart from that, and I've already told you that, is that we constructed this research project as kind of a real-world experiment. So the results from this experiment, which we document not only during this conference, but also during all our other online meetings we had in the course of the year, are then also will then be integrated into the final analysis, and hopefully used for further improving online conferencing and synchronous online communication. Like the feasibility, like my quantitative part, also this qualitative part was about the identification of existing barriers and how they actually stall the implementation of solutions which have been identified previously. So let me just start off with the research infrastructure, and I'm talking about audit schemes here and environmental assessment methods such as EMAS and LEED. And I'm asking myself, is there a favorable environment for increased regulations among researchers? And what actually prevents researchers from acting? And what I found out is that there is actually a lack of accessibility of alternatives for researchers. So it is actually almost impossible for single persons to organize events, to come up or to propose audit schemes, or as you have done, Erica, maybe to propose a carbon budget next to a financial budget. Just in very general, and this will be a theme I'm gonna come back to all along the session, is that the biggest constraints are in terms of institutions are of structural and budgetary nature. it's mostly about missing support infrastructures in the different fields, but also about ill-designed accounting practices and guidelines that are a consequence of our social, political, and economic paradigm. So coming back to research infrastructure, these guidelines and initiatives seem to be well known. That's what I've already said in the last session, but they're scarcely widespread. So they're not really implemented within the institutions. 43% of the researchers have actually indicated that they have had contact with some support infrastructure, and I've already talked that. But there is a need for a more systemic implementation of these audit schemes. And does this mean that there is a low level of resistance? The fact that it's well known but scarcely widespread? And I'd agree it's not. When I'm drawing your attention to the structural constraints now, so structural barriers. What I found out in my qualitative research is that broad support for knowledge about these things doesn't mean that there is low resistance among the research community when it comes to actual practical implementation. And just again to say this is mostly due to the awareness that is present at the institute where these things should be implemented. So if there is a broad awareness about environmental topics, there is actually low resistance, and I've seen that in, for example, at Boku, where Adam is teaching and researching. But there is also broad support, for example, at my institution, which is focused on economics and business, and the resistance is significantly higher. So what are other structural constraints to making research infrastructure more climate friendly? First of all, I'd say it's the heterogeneity of universities. Universities have a really heterogeneous structure, and it is really difficult to evaluate the different emission levels and the different resource usage by different departments, which can the differences can be quite significant when thinking about physics departments, biology departments, or social science departments. So it is difficult to compare. There's this comparability issue, but also to account for all the emissions that are being produced at the research infrastructure. What is also kind of a structural barrier is that for these heterogeneous universities, it's always difficult to come up with a single or homogeneous sustainability strategy, which means that it is needs a lot of time and effort to develop sustainability strategies for universities, and that could be sometimes easier for companies in the free market, I'd say. A big structural constraint I've already drawn your attention to is the missing organizational support infrastructure in terms of the research infrastructure. It's just that there is hardly any sustainability officers that concern themselves or have the capacity to implement audit schemes such as EMAS. It is also due to the missing incentive systems at universities that actually these audit schemes and more climate-friendly research structures have not been implemented. And a really practical notion is that, for example, when these audit schemes are being implemented, that there is a lack of measuring devices or trainings for personnel. So people within the institution don't know how to deal with emissions accounting, for example, or just don't have the resources or the machines to do that. A structural barrier outside the university infrastructure is public transport and bike infrastructure, and I've already mentioned this as one means to, or as one trigger why people use their car still to like 30%, is that cities and communities don't care or don't have the means to provide accurate public transport or a bike infrastructure. Barriers are not of structural nature only, but also of budgetary nature. I've mentioned that already, but to get into detail a little bit more is that audit schemes, as I've researched, actually can save money in the short term, in the beginning, when it comes to efficiency gains, less use of resources. But the longer you implement them and the longer you get audited, the larger the investment gets to actually improve your performance. And that is actually a big constraint, that the accounting practices don't take future benefit into consideration. I come to that later. So what I mean with that is, for example, that investments that have to be done right now, for example, in energy-saving light bulbs, LED light bulbs, or more energy-efficient buildings, the positive financial effects are not being accounted for in future periods. So this is just a huge investment you have to do in this budget period, but it won't appear in the other periods as a benefit. It's also that the traditional calculations of budgets of research institutes don't take green investments into account. So they don't account for the bigger nature sometimes of green investments, and that investments are of course favored for more substantive needs of organizations. For example, creating a research position, employing a PhD, financing research projects often has priority over the energy efficiency of buildings, of course. How can we overcome these barriers? It's actually, I think ecological benefits could be stressed a little more. It needs to be made more public that the adaptation of audit schemes actually saves than costs money, at least in the short terms, due to efficiency gains. And you also have potential positive indirect side effects when making your research infrastructure more climate friendly. And this is on the one hand a gain in attractiveness for researchers and students, but also I have heard about cases where you get advantageous treatment by authorities when you are for example, EMAS certified. So I think now it's time for the first poll, and the first thematic block is over. Erica, are there any questions, comments we can?
Yeah, so I missed a couple of questions last time from Inga and Gunther. I wondered if either of you would like to ask those questions now. If so, you can switch your microphone on.
Yes, it was more a comment. And I think this is not the right time to give this comment, because it was some time earlier, but maybe it's useful. A few days ago, I learned about an initiative of the government area, of the provincial government of Styria. They organized a a commuter bus, a private or publicly run commuter bus from Graz to Vienna, because there are so many employees of the government of Styria who have to meet somebody in Vienna, so that it's cost effective to organize an own bus. So maybe this could be an idea for this problem, that in some regions the connection, the public transport connection between cities and the capital city is not developed well. Maybe that kind of private or university initiative could be an idea for this. Just a comment for this problem of missing infrastructure and missing bus and railway connections.
And I think that does fit well in this session, because that's again something that the institution can do that maybe the individuals have less control over, but we can ask for it. Inga, did you have a question on any of these issues?
Again, it's much more of a comment, I think, than a question. I just wanted to reply to the question that you asked, which was about what people would miss if conferences went completely virtual. And I always find, and a lot of you would probably agree, that the coffee breaks are very important to people, because that's where you make new contacts, and especially researchers, that's where they look for project partners, and where they exchange gossip and all that. So these things are quite important, and I just wanted to bring in one personal experience. I did attend the Planet Under Pressure conference a couple of years in London, and because a lot of people couldn't come to this, they basically organized local meetings. So you had an international conference, but the people who couldn't had met locally, so they would have this sort of coffee break experience, of course with a smaller circle of people, but still they would meet people from their fields and people who shared the same interests. So that impossible way of getting around the issue of not meeting in person.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so again, it's another thing that maybe universities could help to facilitate these sorts of local interactions, as well as longer, larger scale things.
Yeah, I think they'd be ideally placed, because you have, they would be able to provide facilities, but also you have a lot of people who work in a certain field that would probably be happy to meet with colleagues.
Great, okay. Tobias?
Tobias, we can't hear you.
Do you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Could you maybe repeat the question? It was kind of cut off for me.
We just had a couple of observations about how universities can sort of help to facilitate, either by providing local local venues for satellite meetings if there's a larger meeting somewhere that people aren't able to get to, or as Gunther said, by providing transport to specific places if and when that's appropriate.
Yeah. Maybe returning to the poll and the results of the poll. I'm not sure if everyone has participated, but we kind of a mixed result here, that people have actually mostly not been in touch with support infrastructures, which indicates that they're just not present at their institutes. Which is basically confirming what I've just said now. Are there any more questions or comments you'd like to raise? I'd also like to ask Bernhard or Gunther to jump in, because this is also their topic of expertise. So if there is any content-related questions, you're invited, or feel free to add to that, as Gunther already has done.
Anybody?
Okay, so I guess we could then just go on with the presentation. I hope you can all see that now. I'd also like to ask all the participants to, if they had, for example, had contact with these organizational support infrastructures, how that contact was like, or also what would you like to have such a, or do you see the need for organizational support infrastructures that actually facilitate a greening of research infrastructures? Maybe there are some ideas about that floating around.
So for me, I mean, we don't really seem to have much of this at the LSE. We have a I think it's like an environmental leadership group or something, but it seems to be quite closed, and it's a bit hard to understand what they actually do apart from going around putting recycling bins everywhere, which obviously is great, but I don't see anything sort of larger scale happening within the LSE. Does anyone else have any experiences of institutional infrastructures for these sorts of things?
Maybe I can ask Günther to just shortly comment on the experience he had at university, or his experience with certification. So how a certification process starts, or an audit process, just such as EMAS, for example. Günther, would you like to shortly comment on that, or?
Yes, if you like.
Thank you.
I said it again already in my presentation. I think. Am I right that your question is at the start, the very start of this process,
yes,
right?
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. So how is the process being started, and what are the first experiences?
As always, you have to have in with change in organizations, you have to have something like a change agent. So somebody who is fiercely dedicated and engaged, and this has to be somebody at least from the middle of the hierarchy, of course. And if you have that very person, and of course it's better you have 2 or 3 of them, then a process can start, because I've seen in my observations in universities that universities are quite are something like learning organizations. That means if something new pops up, and if it's not complete against the mainstream, and you all know that greening is not really against the mainstream. Of course, dark green is to most people a problem, but light green is not a problem to anyone everywhere in, I would say, almost everywhere in the world. So the answer of the organization will be, let him try, or let him do. And in my session I mentioned that EMAS is a quite nice instrument, because it's an enlightening instrument. You learn a lot about the organization. You are accounting. You have figures, or you produce figures almost everybody can trust in. Of course, you can do adding and multiplication and so on and so on and so on, and nothing happens. And because of this, I said you have to combine EMAS and that kind of instruments. There's not only EMAS, combine it with an action plan. You have to define well, the results, the target figures. You have to define target figures. Without this, EMAS is completely toothless. It makes almost nothing. But well, something I mentioned already, you have to have 1, 2, 3 very committed persons, one person who is paid for the job, so an employee who is responsible for the sustainability performance, plus a fringe of let's say 5 to 10 people who are able and willing to meet once a month and discuss results and discuss new actions, new measures acceptable within the organization, within the university, and that makes it work. When this organizational setting is existing, one can be optimistic for this university or research institution. Okay. But that's the minimum. That's
Great,
the minimum.
Thanks, Gunther. So I think Bernhard has a question or comment.
Yeah, I think it's more or less a comment. So as I said, what you really need, you need enough structure. You need a good organigram, you know. So let me move my webcam here, and maybe let's see if we can manage it, or maybe it's too. This, what you see here in the back of my seat, it's a organigram of our university. And the top level, you can see the rector, and on the basis, it's almost everybody, every member of the university. And what we also was set up, we set up a kind of a green team. So every organization unit at the university has sent one member of the organization unit in this green team that makes sure that every organization unit or research unit has one corresponding member in the green team. Above this green team, there is a kind of management board with these enthusiastic, inspired people, as Günther mentioned. There is one for mobility, one colleague for green meetings, and one colleague for waste management. And you need really inspired people, a small group, and you need one person from the vice rector board or from the top level management, which is also inspired by this idea, moving a university or research institution to a green or dark green organization. And when you have these people together, then you can think about EMAS or stuff like that, you know. First of all, you need a bunch of people to start.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Bernhard, for these insights. If there are not any more comments or questions, I'd just like to go on with my presentation and now turn to research events again. Research events are green events. Like I said before, to those who have not been here, is basically to minimize the environmental impact. In my quantitative research, found out that 71% of science professionals either say that there are or that they do not know of any guidelines for events or meetings that take ecological criteria into. So you can see this here, and now the graph's working. This is the result of my question. And I think this is quite astonishing, but also shows the huge gap there is for green event guidelines. So I again structured it according to structural and budgetary barriers. So what are the structural barriers I have identified? And that is basically what Bernard just said, is that there is a missing organizational and support infrastructure. So to be able to create or hold green events, to organize them, you need a support infrastructure that helps you in the process, which means you have to dedicate at least one person part-time to helping researchers organize green events and training them, for example. What we also see missing at institutes is, again, guidelines and regulation. So as the poll just showed, there is hardly any guidelines and regulation in terms of green events present. So one thing would be to establish these guidelines. What researchers also see missing is incentives by their institutes. So all these above aspects, around 30% of the respondents indicated that they see that missing. And the incentives are related to the organizations they work at, and not, for example, the incentives by funding partners, which I will come to later, which are only at 15%, both with the missing financial support for organizing green events. In general, what I found out, and what you've also just saw, is that there is actually a missing prominence of this green meeting guidelines and green events in general. Although the participants of this conference who are with me right now have another record in this regard, which I'm really happy about. So coming from the structural to the budgetary barriers, what I found out is that budget-wise, it makes an impact because guidelines have to be individually adapted to the institute. Guidelines such as, for example, the UNEP Green Meeting Guidelines are not specifically developed for research institutes. And to adapt these guidelines to your institute and to your heterogeneous university infrastructure actually takes quite a lot of time and effort, and that means also capital to pay the respective persons. What you also have to pay for at a research institute is the support infrastructure. As I've said already, is that when you want to provide this infrastructure for your researchers that they can adhere to these rules, you need a dedicated person who's actually dealing with these matters. And this means you have to pay that person for that job. An indirect barrier constitutes a lack of financial incentives. So within research institutes or within the funding of research projects, there is actually no financial incentive to organize events in a way, which means that the personal researcher doesn't have an incentive to do so. Such incentives could, for example, look like cheaper fares for renting of project rooms, or cheaper fares for renting lecture halls and such things. And for example, for research projects, incentives could be set that in such a, or negative incentives could be set such a way that they, for example, no longer pay for huge amounts of travel expenses and promote synchronous online communication, such as we're doing right now. Just in general, the organization of these research events, the establishment of guidelines, and the creation of the organizational support infrastructure all require quite a lot of working time and labor, which means that this is then also a budgetary constraint. But let's talk about how we might overcome these barriers, or what are arguments for green meetings. So what happens to overcome these barriers, or what has to happen to overcome these barriers, is actually that this green event infrastructure needs to be implemented more systemically and better advertised and supported in organization where it already exists. So this is a twofold dimension. On the one hand, there's organizations or researchers that don't even know about the possibility to organize green events. So for them, there must be a broader advertisement of guidelines that exist, which they can adhere to. And then on the other hand, in big research institutes, often people are not aware of the possibility that they actually can organize green events. So within the institutes, this advertisement has to be fostered as well. What, for example, the University of Salzburg did with Bernhard is that they actually adjusted the green event guidelines of, I think, the Austrian ministry. They adjusted that to, which are based on the UNEP guidelines. They adjusted them to the university system and the university structure. So, and there's more and more institutes who actually do this. So this means that this organizational or administrative burden for adapting green guidelines to your personal institute gets less and less, because there's more institutes and universities actually who have already done that. And they could serve as kind of a best practice example for other institutes. So the University of Salzburg, for example, could help other universities within the German-speaking countries to adapt these guidelines and help develop them, for example. So now I'd like, before I will talk about traveling and flying, I'd like to do another poll. Let me just shortly get for you. In the meantime, have there been any questions, Erica? Comments?
So we have a couple of comments about visibility. So Mandy and Adam were talking about the EMAS, and Adam commented that it's only really visible to researchers in terms of things like rubbish separation and choice of paper resources, cleaning products, that sort of thing. So you might not actually notice that it's happening. And I wondered whether there is a more general point there, that actually if things are more visible, then it's more likely that people will be, be interested or be able or know that a choice exists for them to take it up. So for instance, at the London School of Economics, we have recently got new video conferencing software, but they haven't told anyone about it. I only found out about it when I asked about it. So this visibility issue might be quite a big one. Adam's had his hand up. Adam, would you like to say something?
I would, yes. But I'd just like to sort of, what you just said about the video conferencing. Indeed, we have a similar situation here at the university in Vienna, that there's actually a whole sort of room with a video conference system in it that we just found out about a few months ago. Even though we're actually sort of actively engaged in the issue with this project, and that is very much a topic. And I really wonder how many other colleagues at university know that we have that resource. But maybe sort of a comment related directly to the poll that's going on right now. So I've answered no in terms of support infrastructure for green meetings, but we actually had a very nice experience recently. A colleague of mine is working on the issue of green meetings, and sort of asked about it and went to see our sort of event management people at the university, and they were actually really pleased that, you know, people were coming and interested in their work and sort of making suggestions, and they're now actively involved in getting the university, or will be actively involved in getting the university green meeting certified, because, you know, we went and talked to them. And I think that's one thing that one can certainly do also. So, you know, these people sit in their offices, don't have a huge amount to do with the rest of the university on a day-to-day basis, and one can actually engage them and get them involved.
Okay, thank you, Adam. If there's no more questions or comments, I could just continue maybe with the traveling issue, which is, I think, one of the most important parts of this presentation. In terms of interpreting the results, so you can see it, 50% of people have said no, there is not any kind of support infrastructure, which also confirms what I've just been presenting, I guess. So travel and transportation, 70% of event missions, and astonishingly or not astonishingly, 84% of the respondents of my survey state that they actually don't have any guidelines that take any environmental criteria into account. And where these criteria exist, most of them think that it is actually not sufficiently developed. Can see the results of this survey right here. And I'm going to ask you a similar question later on. So coming to the structural barriers, so what are barriers to alternatives to air travel, or what actually fosters air travel? First point, of course, it has been pretty cheap to fly. The prices for airfares have gone down considerably over the last 2 decades, and it's oftentimes cheaper to fly than to take the train, as we've heard already. Then there's a twofold guideline issue here. The first is that there's actually an active prevention by the current guidelines. So what I found out is that most of the guidelines, and I think that coincides with the experience you have, demand the most economic choice, which then often rules out train travel. The other dimension in terms of guidelines is that there's just no green guidelines or regulation that take environmental criteria into account when it comes to traveling. And that also incorporates CO2 compensation programs for air travel that has to be done necessarily. Another point is with also the research infrastructure is that incentive by institutions are missing. So researchers are not incentivized to go take the train or not take the plane. Also, there is again a missing institutional support infrastructure for people who seek alternatives. So it's the booking for travel trips is mostly done by personal researchers, and they often do not know who to go to, who to speak to when they actually want to find an alternative to flight connections. And especially, and this is from a European perspective, again, this can be quite messy when you have to travel through more than 2 countries in Europe, it's actually really difficult to book trains, whereas it is really easy to book a flight. And there's no support infrastructure at institutes that help you with that. Another structural constraint in general is that the bus and train infrastructure is oftentimes not as developed as the infrastructure for planes, which means train connections are infrequent or not existent, especially when it comes to international train travel. The situation is improving for bus travel, but it's still not to a satisfactory level, and not to a level where it could actually challenge the domination of flight travel. What is also kind of a structural constraint is that institutes have to build up a certain reputation and also host conferences, which oftentimes means conferences are held at places which geographically do not make any sense. This is then often in peripheral regions. There is 2 broader issues I'd like to raise in terms of structural constraints. It's the issue of conference tourism and this need in the research profession to be present at as many conferences as possible. And this fundamentally undermines the effort to make research more climate friendly and to reduce the number of air travel. And this can be related back to our institutional setting, because as long as this institutional setting is arranged in such a way which favors those who actually do travel more by plane, I have to say, there is not going to be any satisfactory result and not going to be any satisfactory reduction in terms of air travel. How can we overcome these barriers? And this is actually a really interesting topic. And it starts, in my opinion, with the guidelines at the institutes. So there are travel guidelines at most research institutes, and they have to be reformed. They just have to be adapted and include environmental criteria. And this doesn't mean replace all air travel, but at least to reduce the number of business trips done by plane or the amount of their emissions. Then again, the promotion of green travel guidelines has to be promoted again, and which I think is also could be promoted is when you don't travel but use online or synchronous online communication. This is actually a really positive financial side, which should be received well in the ears of people who decide on budgets. So this is going to be one of the last polls for today. I'm going to ask you about guidelines concerning business trips. Here we go. Maybe just shortly answer that. And then I'd say I'm going to shortly finish up with my presentation and cover the communication aspect before we then turn to a more general discussion maybe. Erica, what would you say?
Yeah, that sounds good. I was thinking that your point about the sort of professional need to attend conferences is an interesting one. I mean, there was no professional need to attend all these conferences even 20 or 30 years ago. So that's something that has really been brought about by the availability of easy and cheap and convenient travel. So it's certainly not something that is genuinely a professional need, although I certainly find that when I tell people that I choose not to fly, they say, oh, you know, is that career suicide? Well, I don't know yet. Maybe it is. I hope it's not. But we certainly need people to start thinking about these things. And if the if the general expectation, as you say, is that it's bad for your career not to be seen at these conferences, or even bad for the institution's reputation not to be seen at these conferences, then there's just no way you can get around that. So we have to tackle the root cause, which is these beliefs that you need to be at conferences.
Exactly, yeah. So the picture for the guidelines concerning business travel are quite clear. None of the institutes has environment criteria in its travel guidelines. So we could use communication, synchronous online communication, which we are doing right now. And again, coming back to its structural and budgetary barriers, for communication, it's also within the institutes that there is a missing support infrastructure, which we've seen for 52% of the cases. That means there is representatives missing. There is no way to give tutorials or trainings to people to may be able to replace face-to-face meetings. And also the current IT infrastructure, which does exist at the research institutes, does not or pays too little attention to replace face-to-face meetings by technological solutions. Another structural barrier is, in my opinion, also the prominence of simple technologies such as Skype, because there's actually way more powerful tools such as Adobe Connect, which we're using right now. In terms of budget, what the concerns that have been raised in my survey were that investment in new equipment needs to budgetary constraints, but I'd actually like to counter that, because the requirements for participating in this conference are, from a technological perspective, quite low. All you need is a computer and a headset, and so in my opinion, this is not really an argument. The building up of support infrastructures or the maintenance of support infrastructures also costs money, as well as the and familiarization for people that are not used to communication technologies. So how could we overcome these barriers? I mean, we've already talked about the main arguments, which is saving time and money, and I think this is an argument which hasn't developed its full potential. Emissions reductions are still dominated by economic considerations, but could still play a role. And then what could help to overcome these barriers? What the researchers said is that we need to adapt or create support infrastructures, additional equipment like conference rooms for video conferencing, and the organizations should set in incentives. And that was especially important for those that haven't replaced face-to-face meetings by communication technology so far. Also, what was kind of important were incentives by funding partners. So incentives should be set by funding partners that actually foster online communication and reduce face-to-face meetings. I think there is a need for more regulation, but actually the population for my research said that that's not the case. They're not really in favor of increased regulation. And what I've already talked about is that we need to increase the popularity of more sophisticated tools, and in that regard, specifically eliminate reservations and promote the advantages. What we've had in this our research project is actually that we had one kickoff meeting that was person to person, and that from then on we communicated over Adobe Connect in regular meetings, and that was actually really useful. The hardware requirements were really low, which I already said, and what needs to be taken into account is the duration of the meetings should be a little bit shorter than for face-to-face meetings, because there is a lot of impressions to you have to deal with when being in such a tool. But all our project members learned pretty fast. And I'm gonna skip this last poll now and come to like a little sort of conclusion. What I've said and what I want to stress again is that the need to build up support infrastructures in general for research, for the infrastructure research, for communication, and also for events. The most preventive barriers were structural and budget nations in all these points. And they are actually the reason why organizations or research institutes fail to take a pioneering role in our society, which they actually should do. Then there's also, in my opinion, a neglect of organizations which challenge the mainstream and which would actually foster a more sustainable development or society, and that hinders the awareness building among the mainstream. A really good tool to help make research more climate friendly are actually funding partners, because they have the power and the ability to actually tell researchers what to do and how to do it. So they should scrutinize their requirements. And as a positive end, I think that best practice examples do exist and that they really could help to promote the topic. All right, so I think there is a little bit time left for some questions.
Yeah, so great. Thank you very much, Tobias. So, and I think to go with your last point, this is a great example of best practice and getting more people involved. Certainly, I haven't experienced a conference quite as large as this with Adobe Connect before, and I'm still getting used to how it all works with different people raising their hands and the different boxes and everything. But I think it's great. So thank you very much for that. If people have any more questions, please write them in the box. So we're going to take first question from Gunther, if you still have one.
Yes.
Then Adam, and then if anyone else.
Thank you very much, Erica. And first of all, thank you very much, Tobias, for this very insightful presentation. Really was a joy to listen. Just an observation from me, not so much a question. I think we've heard a lot this afternoon about the, so to speak, micro perspective on ourselves. It's looking at our belly, so to speak. So we're looking at our universities, at our research institutes, and what can we do, what can be done, what can be done by the researcher, what can be done by the rector, the organization, and so on and so on. I think we should not forget that this is also somehow a political issue we're talking about, and I mean with political, looking at the framework, at the embeddedness of universe. So just to give an example, I think it was written in the blog or said by somebody that ticketing from Vienna to London is really demanding. It's a real problem. Of course, ticketing from Vienna to London with a plane is not a problem. It's just a problem with the train. Going by train is a problem. This cannot be solved by the researcher or his secretary or the rector or whomever. This maybe could be solved by the organization of the European railway networks. I don't know what's the correct name. And it will be solved, or maybe it will be solved if the Ministry of Science and Research in Austria contacts this organization and says, well, hey guys, we've got a problem. There are, every month there are about 100 researchers who would like to attend meetings or conferences in London, because London is really an important spot in the world, venue for conferences. and it's not possible to get a ticket in the same easy way as with what is it, Easy Flight or whatever that kind of website is. I don't know it. Just it's a question of I don't know, 2 months of proper programming. You've got that red button you have to press on your screen and enter Vienna and London, and 5 minutes later you've got your ticket. That's it. And it's a political issue. This is not the challenge of a researcher or a research project. And this is something I would like to remind you on, that we have also to find this more meso level, not only the level, for our issue, for our problem. Did I get the point?
Yes. Yeah. No. You made a good point, and I think some results of this research project and also from previous projects are actually going into that direction, so that it should be actually result in policy suggestions to organizations that can tackle these problems. Maybe Adam wants to say one sentence about that, but
I'd like to say a couple of things. Firstly, I'd like to supplement Günther's comment from just now with a little bit of anecdotal evidence. Actually, the last time I wanted to go to London by train earlier this year, I did the Austrian railway service, and they quoted me a price of €800 return. When I actually went on 3 separate websites, the Austrian, the Belgian, and then the UK, to sort of put the ticket together that way, I got the return for just over 300, which was then comparable actually to the return flight. And that's obviously a serious issue, you know, that as Günther, you said, I don't think it's even 2 months programming. I think with the right investment, we're talking about a week's programming, and we'd actually have a system that sort of, you know, covers those issues. And there are also things we need to be looking at. And something totally different, but also kind of on the structural level, I'd like to just go back to a point that Erica, you made a little earlier on about sort of tackling the root cause. You know, this question of, is it career suicide to, you know, not attend conferences, and sort of the, you know, the way incentives are structured in the whole academic system. This thing, and it's something we've been sort of looking at, is, you know, well, you know, what does our university look for? It looks for conference visits, and it looks for, you know, as many SCI publications as you can pump out in a year, and citation index and whatever else. But when you actually look at a lot of the research, you know, which is sort of problem-solving orientated research. You know, a classic example would be research on organic agriculture, for example. You know, they have really, really long cycles, and you're talking, you know, sort of sometimes years before you can put out a first publication. Well, you know, that's not going to get you any support from universities, so it's not, you know, there's not the right kind of support infrastructure and structural measures to support that. So I agree, we need to tackle it on a whole bunch of different levels.
Great, okay. Thanks very much, everyone. Do we have, I don't think we have any more questions, unless anyone wants to leap in at the last minute. So in that case, I think we should finish up for today. So thank you very much, Tobias, for 2 really stimulating and interesting talks. There's been a lot of virtual applause happening. I don't know if you've noticed it or not, but there is, it's there. So thank you very much. And what time do we start tomorrow? Is it 3 o'clock CET?
We have the usual setup session, but it's an hour earlier tomorrow, because we're actually going to be, as we have the possibility to participate in a webinar on webinars, which is being organised by David and a few colleagues from Sweden, and that's starting at 3 p.m. Central European time, and we'll be back here at 4 as every other day.
Great. Okay. So thanks everybody for your participation, and we look forward to seeing you all tomorrow.
Thank you, Erica, for moderating, and thank you for everyone else for participating.
Thanks and goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.